Hi everybody, let's continue our discussion of validity. So deductive arguments, a valid argument is a deductive argument. Sorry, I forgot to put deductive in the previous video. Validity and invalidity only is in relation to deductive arguments. But a valid deductive argument is an argument in which true premises guarantee a true conclusion. Another way of saying that is it is impossible to have true premises and also have a false conclusion. Another way of saying is that in a valid deductive argument, if you have true premises, then of necessity your conclusion is true. All right, so we talked about an argument form called modus ponens that is a valid argument form. And we've already talked about an invalid argument form called affirming the consequent that looks a lot like modus ponens, but it's not. But let's talk about a couple more valid argument forms. One is called modus tollens. And this is way of negation. So another valid argument form is if P, then Q, not Q, or let me just write that out, not Q, therefore not P. Now remember in modus ponens it said if P then Q, and we affirmed P, P therefore Q. That's a valid form. But when using, what's an if then statement called again? Correct. It's called a conditional statement. So in modus tollens what we do is we say if P then Q, we negate Q, and therefore of necessity we must negate P. Now this is a valid argument form, which means that if these two premises are true, then whatever your conclusion is necessarily follows as being true. So let's think of, let's use the same example. Or we'll use a different one. If an animal, man, I wish I had like a full board that I could write on. Even this big board is not big enough. Okay, so I'm going to erase this for a second so that I can use the whole board to write things out. If an animal is a dog, then it is a mammal. If an animal is a dog, then it is a mammal. Remember, an if-then statement is called a conditional statement. A snake is not, what do we negate here? Do we say a snake is not a dog, or do we say a snake is not a mammal if it's modus tollens? Correct. We negate the consequent, the second part, we negate mammal. A snake is not a mammal. Therefore, a snake is not what? A dog. So this is a valid argument form called modus tollens. And let's look at this. If an animal is a dog, then it is a mammal. That's a true statement. A snake is not a mammal. That is also a true statement. Now, in a valid argument, if you have true premises, then what do you have of necessity? A true conclusion. So we don't even need to look at the conclusion. So long as we put the correct conclusion in, we know that the conclusion is true. A snake is not a dog. Now you might be thinking like, okay, well I might be able to think of an example that has this structure and the conclusion would be false. Well, good luck. If you can do that, you will become a world-renowned logician. No one yet has been able to come up with an example. Well, yeah, we'll just say that. You can spend hours and hours and hours and hours trying to find an example that has true premises of this form and a false conclusion. Now let's look at a different example. What if I said a cat is not a mammal. So if an animal is a dog, then it is a mammal. A cat is not a mammal. Therefore, a cat is not a dog. Now, is this a valid argument? Yes. The whole time we've been working with this, we've said, if anything in this form, or if anything has this form, then it's a valid argument. But in your head, what are you thinking right now? Well, you're thinking, well, premise 2 is false, right? Premise 1 is still true. If an animal is a dog, then it is a mammal. A cat is not a mammal is false. But the conclusion, a cat is not a dog, is true. So you might be thinking, well, that can't be valid. But remember, validity only deals with the structure of the argument. So if it follows the proper structure, then it's properly valid. Even though this premise is false, it doesn't make the argument invalid. Remember, a valid argument is an argument such that true premises guarantee a true conclusion. If you have a false premise, you still might have a true conclusion in a valid argument. Or you might have a false conclusion. And let's look at an example that really illustrates this. And these are kind of examples that go into the realm of the absurd, which is a place where logicians often like to hang out. And philosophers in general, right? If the moon is made of cheese, let me use a different one. If the moon is in the sky, then it is made of cheese. I'm sorry, again, this is where I need a bigger board. So this is actually premise 1. The moon is not made of cheese, or composed of cheese, if you don't want to bring teleology into it. And if you don't know what I just said, that's okay. So the moon is not made of cheese. So what is the logically valid conclusion that we can draw? If the moon is in the sky, then it is made of cheese. The moon is not made of cheese. Therefore, the moon is not in the sky. Now, of course, the moon is not necessarily in the sky per se. The sky itself is space. The moon is oriented in space. But let's just, again, use typical terms. If the moon is in the sky, then it is made of cheese. Is that true? No, that's false. That's a false statement. The moon is not made of cheese. Well, that's a true statement, or composed of cheese. Therefore, the moon is not in the sky. Let's just say that that's false, even though we just talked about space. But you can see here, this is still a valid argument, right? It has one false premise and a false conclusion, but it's still valid because remember the definition of validity is that if an argument has a valid structure, true premises lead to a true conclusion. So if you have a false premise, it could lead to a true conclusion. It could lead to a false conclusion as well. All right. So that's modus tollens. That's another valid form. But there's an invalid form that looks very much like modus tollens. And this one is called denying the antecedent. When you deny the antecedent, if P then Q, remember modus tollens is always the negation of Q. If P then Q, in this invalid form, you negate the first part, and then your conclusion that you draw from that is the negation of the second part of the conditional statement. So whenever you see this form, if P then Q, not P, therefore not Q, this is an invalid form. People regularly use this form. If we were to symbolize it, which is higher levels of logic, remember the horseshoe is how we symbolize an if-then statement. If P, then Q. And then not in a logic is a tilde. So not P, therefore not Q. Now you don't need to know this, but I like to put it up here because when you get to higher levels of logic, you can actually start taking real sentences and breaking them down or implanting them in this structure, and then you can work with this structure to do proofs. And I know you guys are all really excited, right? You remember geometry with the proofs, you know, like if two sides of a triangle and the included angle are congruent, then the triangles are congruent. You know, I'm sure you love that. It was probably your favorite time. Well, you can actually do that with logic too. And it's quite fascinating and exciting for super nerds, which some of you are. And, you know, I feel connected to you as super nerds. And it's okay to be a super nerd. You ought to be. Okay, but anyway, apart from super nerds, so this is an invalid form. It's a deductive form, but it's invalid. And let's look at an example. If it is raining, then we will go swimming. Let's say and I'm just gonna have to leave it like that. Again, I hate this board. Maybe I need to move all the way to the left. If it is raining, then we will go swimming. We're part of a strange group of people that like to swim while it's raining, which actually is pretty fun, as long as it's not lightning. But it's even more fun if it's lightning, right? Because then you have that extra thrill, like, ah! If it is raining, then we will go swimming. It is not raining. Therefore, we will not go swimming. Now, as you're looking at this, you're probably thinking to yourself, well, that seems like a pretty valid argument. Like, that's a good structure. It's true, right? If it's raining, then we will go swimming. It's not raining, therefore we will not go swimming. It's actually not a valid argument. Of necessity, true premises do not, in all instances, guarantee a true conclusion. Because, for example, here, if it is raining, then we will go swimming. It's not raining. It doesn't of necessity follow that you won't go swimming, right? You still might go swimming, even if it's not raining for some other reason. But let's look at an example that makes it more clear. And we'll go back to our example of animals. It's always good to go to animals or anything that has strict conceptual boundaries. Okay, or we could use the bachelor example. If someone is a bachelor, then the person is not married. Sorry, I'm not going to use that one because it has a not in it and I don't want to throw any people off. Let's just go back. If something is a dog, then it is a mammal. I only want to use positive antecedent in consequent here. If something is a dog, then it is a mammal. A cat is not a dog. Both true, right? If something's a dog, then it's a mammal. That's definitely true. A cat is not a dog. That's definitely true. But what is the conclusion when we deny here, denying the antecedent? What do we have to do? Well, we deny the consequent. So here the conclusion would be a cat is not a mammal. Now, is that true? No, definitely not. This is false. And so what we've done here is we've taken the structure of denying the antecedent and we've plugged in statements, propositions, sentences that are definitely true in 1 and 2. But notice that the conclusion that we arrive at from this is false. So what we've done here is we've presented a counterexample that demonstrates that this form is invalid. Because remember, the definition of validity is that if you have true premises, you must of necessity have a true conclusion. Now, when you deny the antecedent, we've just shown, okay, here's an example. You tell me this is a valid form? Here's an example. Look, it's not valid because it has true premises and a false conclusion, which is impossible in a valid argument. Hence, whoever I'm arguing with, this is an invalid form. Please go figure out a valid form or restate your position. And you can do this a lot. You can scratch it out on napkins while you're at the bar talking over a beer or something. Make people hate you by pointing out their failures of reasoning. But let's change this to the valid form. So that is the example of denying the antecedent. Let's change it back to modus tollens. And we'll use, let's use something that's true. If something is a dog, then it is a mammal. A snake is not a mammal. Or we could use something else here. Let's see. What do we want to say? Like a guppy is not a mammal. Notice here we're negating the consequent. A guppy is not a mammal. Therefore, a guppy is not a dog. Another way to think about this informally is to take these two categories and put them into kind of a circle diagram. So if this is the category of dog, and I say if something is a dog, then it is a mammal, and I have another group of organisms called mammals, how could we think about this sentence with these two? Would it be an overlap of the two? Would one be inside the other? Or would the other be inside the one? Okay, so we have two groups here, mammals and dogs, and we're saying if something is a dog, then it's a mammal. So think about how these two would interact, and they would interact like this. So if something's a dog, then it's a mammal. Here's the category of mammal. Therefore, all dogs are mammals, right? That's another way to say this. All dogs are mammals. If something's a dog, then it's a mammal. And there are also other things in here that are mammals, like cats and echidnas and caribou and desert rats, desert shrews, and manatees and whales and all these other things, right? But notice what this says. A guppy is not a mammal. So if we have the group of guppies, and we say a guppy is not a mammal, then the guppies have to fall outside of the mammal class, right? And let me erase all these classes here so we don't get too confused. So initially what we said was, if something is a dog, then it's a mammal, okay? All dogs are mammals. But a guppy is not a mammal. And if the guppy falls outside of the mammal, then of necessity, it cannot be a dog, right? So that's another visual representation of a way that you can think about the validity of this argument. Of necessity, if the guppy falls outside the mammal, then it must fall outside the dog. Now, if the guppy just only fell outside the dog, like a cat, for example, and this shows why denying the antecedent is an invalid form. If we say that a cat is not a dog, it does not necessarily mean that it's not a mammal. And so cats can fall inside here. Okay, so that's the second valid form of argumentation, or one of the most common forms of valid arguments is modus tollens. Let's do a couple more formal valid forms, and then we'll call it a rest. The next valid form is called hypothetical syllogism. And this is the one that usually makes the most sense to people beginning the journey toward logical analysis. That sounded really important, didn't it? Okay. If P, then Q. If Q, then R. If P is the case, then Q is the case. If Q is the case, then R is the case. Therefore, what is the logical outcome, do you think? You guys are great. You got it. It's if P, then R. And if you didn't get that, you're still great, right? Okay, so if P, then Q. If Q, then R. Therefore, if P, then R. So if P is the case, and P makes Q the case, and Q makes R the case, then if I have P, then I must of necessity have R. Now, again, you don't need to know this part, but it's another way to visualize it. If P, then Q. If Q, then R. And we know that the horseshoe means if then, if this, then that. So therefore, if P, then R. Now, I'm not going to write out this example, but we can think of things that relate like this, right? So, let's see. If something is a chihuahua, then that thing is a dog. If something is a dog, then it's a mammal. Therefore, if something is a chihuahua, it's a mammal. Now, because this is a valid argument form, true premises guarantee a true conclusion. If you have false premises, you might end up with a false or a true conclusion. Like, if you're a human, then you are a snake. If you are a snake, then you walk around on your belly. Therefore, if you're a human, then you walk around on your belly. Well, that might be the case. Here, premise one would definitely be false if we're just talking about the organism and not like a human as a snake, because we call people snakes sometimes. And then the conclusion would more than likely be false, although there are probably some humans who do move around on their bellies, unfortunately, in this unjust and horrific world that we live in. I was one time in India, and we took some food and stuff to these people who were kind of living in this little area, and all these children came out of these like shacks, and they were running up, and something out of my peripheral vision was moving toward me in this very bizarre fashion, and I thought it was an animal coming to attack me because of its low stature and the way it was moving. And I was like looking at people, and I turned and looked because I was a little bit frightened, and it was a child whose legs were so contorted that one leg was withered and the other was coming up next to his head, and the only way he could move was to like kind of pull himself along the earth, and it was an extremely traumatic experience. So that's what I meant when I said that. Unfortunately, some humans suffer very much in life, and it's very difficult to think about those things. But anyway, do you guys like puppies? Puppies are so cute, right? Okay, so hypothetical syllogism is another valid form. And then we'll end with another syllogistic form. Remember, a syllogism is merely a deductive argument that has two premises and a conclusion. And the final one that we're going to talk about is called disjunctive syllogism. Oh, by the way, did you notice hypothetical syllogism? Remember, I told you that an if-then statement is sometimes called a hypothetical statement? Well, notice, in hypothetical syllogism, all of the statements are hypothetical statements, hence the name. In a disjunctive syllogism, we have a disjunct. Now, a disjunct is the technical name for an or statement. So what we have here is P or Q, not P, therefore Q. And this is a valid form. So if I tell you I'm either a man or I'm a woman, but I'm not a man, therefore of necessity I must be a woman. Now, again, in that case, second premise would be false. But whenever you have a disjunct, an or statement, P or Q, and you negate one of them, then of necessity, the other must be true. So if these two premises are true, the conclusion is true. This is a valid form. There's another invalid form, P or Q, and we say P, therefore not Q. And people might think this is the case, right? So Justin's either a man or a woman. Justin is a man, therefore Justin is not a woman. Now, that is true, true, true. However, this is an invalid form, which means that it doesn't guarantee the truth of the conclusion, which can be demonstrated by saying something like Justin is a man, or he is a philosophy professor. Justin is a man, therefore he's not a philosophy professor. And in that case, the premises would be true and the conclusion is false. So this is an invalid form, but disjunctive syllogism itself is a valid form. P or Q, not P, therefore Q. So if I have a bag and you can only see the paper bag, and I say I have apples or oranges in the bag, and then I say, but I don't have apples. Then of necessity your mind says, well, you got oranges, right? And if I'm telling you the truth about those two things, then of necessity the conclusion must be true. So you can see how our minds naturally follow these steps. Now, of course, naturally we fall down the wrong rabbit hole every now and then when we use the invalid forms. But okay, so we've introduced 4 valid forms: disjunctive syllogism, hypothetical syllogism, modus ponens, way of affirmation, and modus tollens, way of negation. And so you can watch the previous 2 videos, this one and the one before it, and just familiarize yourself with these valid forms and try to begin to identify these valid forms from their closely related invalid forms. And again, use this in your life. When somebody presents an argument to you, think about it. Like if they start saying if then, think in your mind like, okay, if P, then, okay, I see what you're saying, I see what you're saying. Oh wait, you negated P. Oh, therefore I know it's not a modus tollens, invalid form, you're wrong, right? And then, no, of course we don't want to say, oh, you're wrong, we don't want to like offend people at work or whatever. But at the very least, we can know in our minds that they're not presenting valid argument forms. So what, finally, I'm all about repetition. A valid argument form is a deductive argument form in which true premises guarantee a true conclusion. And you can always attempt to show that an argument is invalid by presenting an example in which the example has true premises, but it leads to a false conclusion.